If you remember last week, I told you, I believe it was last week or the week before, that I had seen some stupid post on a forum somewhere where people were talking about how the Exodus couldn't have occurred, and they were talking about the Sphinx and all this stuff and how it's not mentioned in the Bible. And it really dawned on me that there are just a lot of moronic people out there, okay? Uneducated is one thing. To be uneducated is not a sin, but to be moronic probably is, okay? So I decided that I would take this journey, but the way I'm approaching this is pretty complicated. The material itself is not complicated, but the way I'm approaching this is. So I want you to know that everything I do today, I will probably not get to my message. All right. Just saying. So, countless individuals, more than I care to say that I've seen and witnessed with my own eyes, have postulated that the biblical record of the Exodus of the children of Israel could not have occurred, therefore completely discounting most of the ancient record. The problem is, if you read this book, and not superficially, and I'm talking about the Bible, it does open up almost this part of, I believe, of all of our brains have this dimension of curiosity, to seek, to probe, and God's not offended by that, by the way. If we actually start looking at the Bible, it requires, first and foremost, that we approach it by faith. That is the premise. But after that, if we really want to talk to those folks out there that are just absolute hardheads, there's abundant proof for most of what is written. And let me just start with the Pentateuch and what's in the Pentateuch. We know that God spoke to Abram and gave a promise of his descendants being as numerous as the stars in the sky and of the sand of the sea. Now, that did not happen in Abram's lifetime, number one. Number two, the confusion that most people have, which as I go through this, not today, but eventually, I'm going to establish terminology. There are way too many people that are confused about Israel, Hebrew, who are the Jews, lopping everything together when you hear talks about people saying, I support Israel, and they don't really know what they're saying. Specifically, this is important. All of what I'm doing today will be important in the studies to come. So pretty much if you miss this message, we'll hope that somebody puts a footnote somewhere if you are seeing the next in the series of this to go back to the first place so you can get a foundation for where this all started. So we know that God spoke to Abram, gave him this promise. And if we know about that, we follow the Bible through to the passages that begin about the children of Israel being in Egypt's bondage. And there begins this conundrum. So in order for me to actually establish some proof and some verity about the Exodus and the children of Israel, I actually have to take a big leap forward. And then once I take that leap forward, I'll work my way backward. And in the process, those of you who are familiar with this teaching ministry for many, we'll say over 20, 30, 40 years plus, will know why this foundation is so crucial. Not just because I want to deliver something convoluted and confusing today. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to fast forward. Remember what I said, to establish the children of Israel, the bondage, and many other things. We're going to fast forward to what is the children of Israel entering into the promised land. If you remember, they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, and Moses did not get to enter into that land. He got to look into the land, but he did not enter in. That task was appointed to Joshua. We find all of the chronicles of this that occur in the book bearing Joshua's name and the book of Judges. So when I say there are certain things that we can know for sure, we can know that a people entered a specific land, which the Bible tells us. God instructed those people basically to conquer all the inhabitants, gave instruction, but they didn't. So they lived among other nations, other races. And as we begin to see this story all unfold, basically, I don't want to go too much further into, we'll call it Joshua's issues, but we know something. We know that, people say, for example, did the Battle of Jericho, did the walls actually come tumbling down? Did this really happen? Could this have happened? It's impossible that people marched around the city and somehow these walls, at the blow of a trumpet, came tumbling down. And the people who'd like to be logical say, well, it had to be an earthquake, if it happened at all. Here is what I can tell you. Archaeological digs at Jericho are abundant proof. And when I say abundant proof, I mean anyone who actually looks at the evidence unearthed at Jericho, it's quite mind-boggling. If you recall, if you're familiar, if you're not, please make notes of this and go and read this in your own time. But if you recall, we know that there were 3 cities burned by fire in the book of Joshua. One, obviously, is Jericho, Ai, and Hazor. Joshua 6:24 chronicles Jericho, Joshua 8:28 Ai, and 11:11 is Hazor. These have all been dated. These 3 cities have been dated. And again, I'm not going to be exact on this because there's a sliding scale with a lot of details which I could not put into an hour here. But most of this is dated to approximately the 15th century BC. Now, here's what's riveting about all of these events. When they started to dig this site, and there was a woman who was a great pioneer in her field, Kathleen Kenyon, who did an amazing work. But if you read her work, we know that she actually unearthed some very critical information for us. The problem is she basically placed it in the wrong date. 12 years after her death, research starts to come out because digs did not cease when she died. People kept digging. And what we have is called stratigraphical evidence. That's the layers of the earth. And if you start with the first layer, and that's how archaeological digs are done, by layers, you get down to a certain level. And within the soil, when they dug at these 3 locations, they found, correlating to this time frame, ashes, burnt ashes, representing these cities, where it says that they were told to burn and destroy the cities. That indeed happened. Those levels of earth, by the way, they do not lie. So what's even more astounding is that there is actually, which predates this book of Joshua, there is a Neolithic settlement that actually dates back to 8,000 BC in that very area which eventually will become Jericho. So there's a long history there. And why I'm doing this, you'll see, I've approached the Bible myself by faith. I didn't need archaeology. I didn't need secondary or tertiary evidences. But I'm astounded that there is such great ignorance concerning this book, where people would like to make it a tapestry of great mythological stories all woven together. And somehow, if we are able to show, as I'm doing right now, and not just by this evidence, but there are so many pieces of evidence just at Jericho alone to corroborate the biblical telling of what happened through the vast majority of this book, you have to step back a little bit and take off the ignorance cap, I wanted to call it something else, and start looking at this book with a different set of eyes. So, you've got that. The thing that Kathleen Kenyon did unearth was the walls at Jericho. And here's what's so important. Almost every wall of that city did indeed come tumbling down. They found complete evidence of this, except for one structure that remained intact, which fits the description exactly of the house of Rahab the prostitute. It's staggering. The evidence beyond that. You've got a man who did more work after Kenyon's death. Before Kenyon, Garstang's work. He found pottery, Cypriot pottery. And again, this may not be of great interest, the terminology, but I really urge you on your own to go and look up some of these things and go to good sources. Don't go to Wikipedia, okay? Or there are some sites that would like to tell you, I don't know what evidence, but go to the sites where they are referencing these particular archaeologists and their work, and you can see the complete, it is so, it's quite large. As I said, there's no way that I'm just giving you bullet points. There was also another form of pottery found at the site. This pottery basically reveals, because it has painting on it, it has some artwork on it, that can be dated to a specific period. We're talking about the time of Joshua. Not only that, but there's something else that they found there. They found 3 Egyptian scarabs. And these 3 Egyptian scarabs are very important. First of all, there's no reason for Egyptian scarabs. Egyptian scarabs are kind of a ovular shape, usually made of stone, usually bearing the image of a pharaoh or a deity and a name inscribed on the bottom. These 3 scarabs belong to 2 kings and 1 queen of a particular range of time dating from the 18th, I believe, through to the 14th century BC. And the question is, why on earth were they there? And they're found, by the way, in that layer of the soil. So there's all these different questions. There's even more evidence, which I'm just going to go through. I'm going to thumb through because it's really important to put these down, and I'll circle back in a minute. They found large amounts of grain. This is the staggering thing. If Jericho was sacked by this time, it would have been that the grain would have been seized, because grain was not only used for eating, it was used for trade. The fact that they found whole caches or stashes of grain corroborates what God said, which is everything in the city must remain there. Nothing is to be removed from the city, period. Now think about it. In that day and age, grain would be analogous to gold in our day. So there are a lot of different things here at work that I can say are vitally important. The other thing about the grain is we know that if you're reading the passage that refers to Rahab hiding the spies, it says clearly that she had flax on the rooftop, and there's a reason for that. It was during harvest time, and she was drying it. We know that this all occurred during a harvest period. All of this, by the way, you can see it in the earth. You can read it in the Bible, but you can see it in the earth. So let me go back a little bit to Rahab, because she's actually the key to a lot of other things. For those that don't know the story, she is called a woman of ill repute, and she hides these spies in her household. And she is told by these spies to hang a scarlet cord out her window. Now, not clear maybe so much in our King James, but in the Hebrew it becomes clear. For me, actually, it's a new discovery. You'll never learn everything and know everything in this book. I don't care who you are, how brilliant you are. You never will, neither will I. The spies had to use that same scarlet cord as she would hang out the window as the sign of obedience when they told her to gather her family and stay indoors and hang the cord outside. That cord, by the way, goes through the Bible representing the blood of Jesus Christ, and all go by there. The prostitute, the spies, they all have to go by that same cord, which is, I love that little footnote right there. But I would say that why this becomes an important part is once you read this and you're looking at the archaeological evidence, and then you jump to the New Testament, and in the genealogies of Matthew, specifically, Matthew 1:5, we have the mention of Rahab in there. We know that Rahab is a descendant in the lineage to our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And this becomes kind of a footnote. See, if you can establish, if you're trying to educate people, and you can establish that there are hard pigs, we'll call them real tangible evidence that demands to be looked at, not just kind of, okay, I see it. There's so much there at Jericho. That's why I chose to start there, and I said I'd work my way back. So, if we see this, we can definitely make some hard connections. Remember, I said the red cord goes through the Bible, so I'm going to use that to go backwards. If you recall, I just said that this red cord out her window, right? That would be the sign for her to be saved, and indeed she was. Her house was not destroyed. I go back to the names of the two archaeologists specifically, Ernst Selling and Karl Watzinger, who, amidst the devastation in those digs, found this complete, intact remain, which they believe to be the house of Rahab. So when we start talking about the Bible, it's important to kind of look at this through all different perspectives. Now, this may seem like a very long approach, so you have to bear with me. I told you I might not get to where I need to go, so just bear with me and please have patience. The reason why I'm using this red cord is because if you go back, now we're going to a time before the children of Israel are in Egypt's bondage. And I'm going to use the red cord to go back to a time. Most of you in this congregation are familiar with the story of Judah, who is one of the he's one of the sons of Jacob who became Israel. He's the fourth in line, Judah, who basically, Judah, has three sons, Onan, and Shelah. And his daughter-in-law, Tamar, who plays a big role in this. I will read a little bit to give some backdrop of what I'm saying. But the important thing is that this Judah, he is one of the, we'll call him important, they're all important, but from the children of Israel that become the tribe of Judah. But he is indeed the child born out of all of the children that become the sons of Israel, the children of Israel. And it is this strange story. So Judah was married to a Canaanite woman named Shua. He has three sons, and I believe it is his first son that is married to this girl named Tamar. He dies, the first son dies, and as was customary, because she was still childless, as was customary, the second son would have taken the place of the first son to basically impregnate her, to provide a line, because basically in that day and age, women had only one role, and that was to produce children. Barring that she wouldn't have children, there would have been a big void in the pages of our Bible. She is the key role, by the way, to the children that will descend directly to Christ. So, first son dies, second son Onan, he will not fulfill his responsibilities to impregnate her. And of course, most of you have heard of the sin of Onan. He basically spilled his seed rather than impregnating her. He dies. Both sons are killed. There's one son remaining, Shelah. He is too young yet to marry and take Tamar as his wife. So interestingly enough, as the details go, and most of you are familiar with the story, but for those who are not, Tamar, who is in mourning for her husband takes off her mourning, her garments of widowhood, if you will, disguises herself, covers her face. She knows that her father-in-law, Judah, is going to a city to shear sheep. She's sitting by the wayside, and I'll pick up to read for those who are not familiar with the story, because it becomes very important to understand the intricacy of all of this. I'm reading from Genesis 38:15, and I'm picking up just where I kind of gave you the details. When Judah saw her, I'm going to read from the NIV for the benefit of our listening audience. Please follow along with whatever Bible you have open. When Judah saw her, referring to Tamar, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, "Come now, let me sleep with you." "And what will you give me to sleep with you?" she asked. He says, "I'll send you a young goat from my flock," he said. "Will you give me something as a pledge until you send it?" she asked. He said, "What pledge should I give you?" She said, "Your seal and its cord and the staff in your hand." That's what she answered. Now she was wise because she knew if she did not have these proofs, she would have been put to death as a whore. That would have happened. So this is very calculated. It's equally calculated that I'm not going to say that Tamar knew the important role that she bore in all of this, but there had to be some concept of importance to understand she could not die without bearing a child. So basically, what will you give me? Your seal, its cord, and the staff in your hand. So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. After she left, she took off her veil and put on her widow's clothes again. Meanwhile, Judah sent the young goat by his friend, the Adullamite, in order to get his pledge back from the woman, but he did not find her. He asked the men who lived there, "Where is the shrine prostitute who was beside the road at Enaim?" They said, "There hasn't been a prostitute here." So he went back to Judah and said, "I didn't find her." Besides, the men who lived there said, "There hasn't been any shrine prostitute here." Then Judah said, "Let her keep what she has, or we will become a laughingstock. After all, I did send her this young goat, but you didn't find her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar is guilty of prostitution, and as a result, she is now pregnant." Judah said, "Bring her, and I will have her burned to death." And she was being brought out. She sent a message to her father-in-law, "I am pregnant by the man who owns thee," she said. And she added, "See if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are." Judah recognized them and said, "She is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't have given her my son Shelah." And he did not sleep with her again. Now when it came time for her to give birth, there were twins in her womb. And as she was giving birth, one of them put out his hand, so the midwife took a scarlet thread. There is your scarlet cord. Took a scarlet thread, tied it on his wrist, and said, "This one came out first." But when he drew back his hand, his brother came out, and she said, it's very interesting, she said, "And this is how you've broken out." He was named Perez. Then this brother who had the scarlet thread on his wrist came out, and he was given the name of Zerah. So depending on what you're reading and the interpretation, you may read either Perez. There are different spellings, but it's all the same. Zerah, Zara, they're all the same children, all right? This is important because what we have here, again, I'm tying it to the scarlet thread. What we have here are two children who basically, as they grow up, will become very important. We know that the Phares line, when you go to read the New Testament genealogy to Christ, the Phares line is mentioned there. What's very revelatory is you find only 3 generations of Zerah's descendants chronicled, and then they disappear from the pages of this book, and there's a reason why. Now, you'll have to forgive me, but as I said, there's a lot of stuff here, and if I seem to be rushing, I am, because I'm worried I won't fit this all in. We know, I'm fast-forwarding to something. We know that as all of the children grow up, we're talking now back at the children of Israel. If you remember the story about Joseph, he's sold into basically slavery, told that he's dead. He becomes imprisoned in Egypt until he interprets Pharaoh's dream. And basically, in a nutshell, he becomes second in command right under Pharaoh because he basically saved the Egyptian people, but he also saved his brethren, interpreting Pharaoh's dream about feast and famine. So what becomes important here is to recognize that while the children of Israel were in the land of Goshen, this happens just before they go into Egypt's bondage. They're living in a place called Goshen, Joseph, all of his brethren, and we know at that time the children or the descendants of Zara, of the Zara line, they ruled that territory. Why is this important? Because they become known, these people become known as the Hyksos. And let me just stop for a second and say there is good evidence to connect Zerah and Zerah's descendants with these Hyksos people. Now, a lot of people, when they're trying to figure out did this travel into bondage occur, this is why I'm painting the picture in the background. We know that they lived an incredible life in Goshen before they went into bondage. And by the way, this was foretold to Abraham by God that they would go into a land, that they would eventually be in bondage for a time, and then they would come out as a populous people, great in substance. So when we begin to kind of investigate this, something interesting happens. You find the descendants of Zara, or Zerah, depending on what you're reading, listed in 1 Chronicles 2 and verse 6. And it says, "And the sons of Zerah, Zimri and Ethan, Heman and Chalcol and Dara, 5 of them in all." So we have good reason to understand and connect these dots. By the way, I'm going to back this up with some archaeological evidence as well, because I think this is important. There is also a mention of these children of Zara in 1 Kings 4:30 and 31, being compared to having great wisdom, not as great as Solomon, but as great in wisdom. You got to be pretty great in wisdom to be put side by side with Solomon, all right? So that tells you these were really smart kids. Now, as I said, we know that the chronicle of the children of Israel going into bondage begins with what is said in Exodus 1:8. "Now there rose up a ruler in Egypt who knew not Joseph." That tells you a lot of things. That tells you that the time frame that they were living in Goshen had to be substantial. A lot of people think it was a small period of time. In fact, if you're curious, there is a great work that was written by Petrie, Flinders Petrie, with a date of Chronicles that tells you an approximate time. Equally, the historian Manetho chronicles an approximate period of time, and it is much more than just a few years, which tells you that would make sense then that a pharaoh would come up and not know who Joseph was. If Joseph saved the land, right? Doesn't make sense that this would happen rapidly. This happened over the course of time. Why this becomes important? The ancient historian Manetho refers to these foreign rulers in Egypt as Hyksos, Hik being translated for king and Sos for shepherd in Egyptian. There's also a statement in Genesis 46:34 that says, "Every shepherd is an abomination unto the Egyptians." It means that they were not well liked anyway. What we know about these people, remember I just mentioned the land of Goshen. Well, if you're into archaeology, look up at your leisure, and as I said again, I will give you names of people who have researched this. But the city of Avaris, which is none other than the place that would be where these Hyksos shepherd kings, along with all of the children of Israel, lived before they went into bondage. What is remarkable, it is called today Tel El Daba. Excavations began there in 1885, and digs have been going on since then. What is staggering? And here comes some good information. First of all, Avaris has no meaning in Egyptian. You know, everything has meaning. Avaris has no meaning in Egyptian. However, if these people were referred to as Hebrews, remember, people make this mistake of calling all the children of Israel Jews. That is a fallacy. Please stop it, okay? People who do that just drives me nuts. That's ignorance. They were not all Jews. In fact, that is my goal, is to try and establish there's a lot of things that will be cleared up from these messages. But Joseph is referred to as a Hebrew. For example, in Genesis 39:14, in the Hebrew Bible, he is called Haish, the man. And the term Hebrew being translated Iberi or Ivri. So Ish Ivri, avarice, okay? And you can look all these things up. It's not like I'm making these up. In the late 1980s, Professor Bitek found the remains of a great statue at Avarice. And this is, again, this becomes some just mind-boggling information. This statue, and please remember what I'm going to say about his hairdo. The statue is a statue of a man. He has what is described as a mushroom hairdo. And please remember this, because it'll be key for something else I'm going to say later. His whole face and clothing are not Egyptian. He is clothed in a multicolored robe, and he has a throw stick over his right shoulder, symbolizing the right to rule. If you look at the statue, there is no way that this is Egyptian. This statue is none other, it is believed, and I believe it to be none other than Joseph. The palace at Avarice has all of these columns, 12 pillars, representing the children of Israel, with 12 tombs inside. Equally interesting, 2 of the 12 tombs contain bronze daggers, and I don't think this is an error. If you remember that Simeon and Levi took revenge for their sister who was raped, and in the blessings towards the end of Genesis, it's described that they're basically violent, described as killers, if you will, or their methods. I don't think that that's an error that these 2 tombs possess daggers. You could say, well, that could be any ancient tomb. But the coincidences become too many. And that leads me to one other thing that is quite staggering that was found there, which is a cylinder. For those of you who've seen me sit on festival and show you a lot of antiquities that I collect, the cylinders are usually no bigger than this. They're about that round in circumference. And basically the idea was that you would roll them out to imprint. Well, this particular cylinder, which has been deciphered by Rabbi Bar Ron, is fascinating because all of the symbolism on the cylinder correlates to the description of when Jacob is blessing his children. Jacob, Israel's blessing his children towards the close of the book of Genesis. And he describes, for example, the lion. He's describing certain animal characteristics or whatever. They are on that seal. Now, if you start looking at this, you have to come up to this conclusion that there are way too many coincidences of what has been found at Avarice and the digs and all the information. So, now I've laid the foundation to kind of show what is there archaeologically speaking at Avarice. So, it is not a stretch when you begin to read secular chronicles. Diodorus Siculus describes many exoduses that occurred before the main exodus of the Bible. He says that foreign rulers were driven from the land of Egypt. And we know we are very well able to identify that, I'm not going to say all those who left before the Exodus, but we can identify some of these that left as being the sons, the descendants from that Judah line of the descendants of Zerah. Remember, I opened this 1 Chronicles 2 and verse 6, the sons of Zerah, Zimri, Ethan, Heman, Chalcol, and Dara, or sometimes referred to as Darda. So, you got to hang with me for this. We know that these people who left before the children of Israel went into bondage took off, and basically they end up founding territories, if you will. Darda or Dardanus founded Troy. We have good evidence of that. You're going to see that his brother Chalcol heads on to found several royal dynasties. The one with great import will be the Irish line of the kings of Ulster, which we can all back up archaeologically and then by many infallible proofs. Chalcol or Chalcol is also known as Cecrops, the first king of Athens. Now, indulge me for a second. If you read Greek history, most of it is nestled in mythology. So please don't go and look this up and think that you're going to find the history of the Greek people by reading their mythology. But what you will find, the Table of Nations, Genesis 10, Javan are the original stock of the Greek people. A flux of people will show up, and again, they will oust the ruler. They will basically, first king of Athens is this Cecrops, none other than who is mentioned here, Calcol. And he is said to have instituted laws of property, marriage, a new form of worship, and the abolition of human sacrifices. Equally fascinating. Remember, these are children from the line of Judah. Equally fascinating. If you can do the research yourself, it's there in plain sight. Two places, if you look on the map in Greece, in the Greek Isles, look up Mount Ida, I-D-A. There are two locations. And those two locations actually in antiquity were called Mount Judea, Mount Judah. So it becomes very important. We begin to see these incredible pieces of information. Now, I stop here to ask you a question. Have you ever stopped to ask, who are the nations? Who are these people? Where did they come from? And do we really have history accurately told to us? Because remember, there's a lot of people who just like to take this book and throw it in the garbage, discount it whole cloth. It's just a bunch of mythological fabrications. I have a lot of trouble with that because now you get into things, for example, and I don't have really time to do this justice, but you get into seeing how early the alphabet, for example, if you, and I study handwriting, I study the study and the evolution of writing. We can clearly see if you line up Old Hebrew script, which is actually Phoenician or Proto-Canaanite, line it up beside Old Greek, and you will find that these look very much alike. They begin to morph in different ways as things get modernized. Now, again, there are, as I said, a plethora of proofs to put this all together when we say, could the exodus of the children of Israel had actually happened? Did they wander in the wilderness for 40 years? Were plagues poured out as recorded in the Bible? Well, let me put it to you this way. I just painted you some very heavily detailed bookends with archaeological evidence on both sides. So methinks what's in the middle is not that hard to believe once you kind of establish these pillars. It becomes clear from scholars who took the time. There's a great work. I received permission to use the entire work, which I may actually end up doing. But Carlton Stevens Kuhn and his The Races of Europe, it's from Greenwood Press, Connecticut, dated from 1939. And I'm going to read you something that's in there. The age of metal began in Egypt and Mesopotamia, and had spread to the Aegean, Crete, probably received metal influences from Palestine and Egypt before most of the Anatolian mainland. In the diffusion of the early Middle Age, culture westward along the Mediterranean and northwestward up the Danube, the peoples of Asia Minor, Crete, and the Aegean played an important role in acting as transmitters of impulses which originated in Egypt and Sumeria. So you cannot miss the connection. It's there. Remember I mentioned mushroom? Have any of you ever bought a supplement, a mushroom supplement? Read the bottle. It says mycos. That's kind of the word more or less. That means mushroom. Where do you think we get the word Mycenaean from? Mushroom. So when you start peeling this back, you realize how important this book is and all of its clues to start piecing together, and I'm going to make a reference to something. These first Mycenaeans would herald from the tribes of Judah and later Dan. And it is irrefutable. There are people that would say, oh gosh, don't even go there. but these become important in establishing facts. And that's what I'm after. I don't care about, you can actually look at a lot of Greek mythology, and if you actually read it carefully, you're going to find that it's not all completely mythological. They've taken some names that, for example, at a later time, there's a whole story about Troy, and we have a person that appears as Priam in their chronicles mythologically, which if you took that name back to the Hebrew would be none other than, I'm not suggesting that is Ephraim of the tribe of Ephraim, because it is not, but it would be a Hebrew name akin to Ephraim. So there's so much evidence here. And that brings me to talk about, as I said, the founding of places like Troy. Excavation started there in 1870 by Schliemann, and they have proven that Troy did indeed exist, a very large city. There are also exterior evidences in Hittite writing, believe it or not. And as they began to dig, found several successive layers. So Troy, if you're going to look this up, I'm giving you the tools to do so. Troy is labeled as Troy 1, Troy 2, Troy 3, Troy 4, and so on. And we're looking at periods that fit into either 3 or 4, which date from 2300 to 1750, or 1750 to 1300 BC. The earth, by the way, my friends, does not lie. So when they started digging, and they begin to see that, Troy was not some fabricated city that Homer just conjectured or conjured up in his mind, that Troy was indeed destroyed by fire, possibly later earthquakes. We know that Greek cities existed prior to this, as I referenced the original peoples who may have settled there from Genesis 10, Javan. But what's interesting is if you follow this pattern, you see how everything else begins to take shape in the world. Aeneas, who would be the last of the Zara bloodline, leaves Troy, founds something called Lavinium, marries the king of the Latins, which will become the Roman Empire. These are absolute, traceable, important pieces of information. But then there's other pieces of information. You have a people referred to as, and I hope I do this right, the Lacedaemonians, or more commonly called the people of Sparta in southern Greece. And we know that there were friendly relations in antiquity between these people. But what we come to know, not just from secular sources, but if you have a book, an Old Testament from, I'm holding up a Septuagint, which is the Greek. It is the Old Testament translated into Greek, which includes Apocrypha, none other than the book of Maccabees inside. And you begin to read in the book of Maccabees itself. It says in 1 Maccabees 12, beginning at verse 21, it is found in writing, the Lacedaemonians and Jews are brethren. Let that settle in for a minute. Now remember, by this time, the term Jew has definitely morphed into what we would kind of commonly use it today. So let's not get confused. As I said, I will set the tone eventually and get all this straight. It is found in writing that the Lacedaemonians and Jews are brethren, and that they are of the stock of Abraham. Now, therefore, since this has come to our knowledge, you should do well to write unto us of your prosperity. And here begins, in the book of Maccabees, which will place in what we would call the intertestamental period, those 400 years when people say there was silence between the old and the new. This is written. Somebody back there uncovered some tangible proof to say, hey, we're related back there in the woodpile. So make no mistake about this. And the reason why I bring this all to your attention is because when we start to talk about something verifiable, something that we can know with absolute certainty, I've just painted you, as I said, great bookends, and you can begin filling in the details. And you start seeing how these very same people I described in the first primary exodus out of Egypt, which is before the exodus of Moses. We have people taking off, and basically from the area that we're looking at, Greece, going up to found different areas, planting, we'll call them flags, by naming cities and states after themselves. And we begin to see a footprint, a tapestry, that later on will become the subject of the lost tribes of Israel. And my goal here is to set a few records intact here, put the core of this down to say that you cannot approach this book by looking for proof. You must approach it by faith first. But if you're willing to look and do the hard legwork to dig, just like the archaeologists did, and there's abundant proof, as I said, then we end up having to look at, as I said, these great bookends that I've laid the foundation for. And let me then ask the question, if these bookends that I've shown you before the Exodus, avarice, and all of these names that we can see and deduce that have been peppered among the lands, and the references that we have by virtue of what's been done at Jericho and other places, archaeologically speaking, who is going to doubt what happened in the middle? It's rhetorical. Who's going to doubt that? Now, again, I go back to those people who say, well, there's no proof. Well, here's the problem with that. If there's technically no proof and you just want to start picking right there at the Exodus, let me ask the question, what happened to such a great culture and people, such as the Egyptians, that their culture merely declined and eventually disappeared? They still exist as Egyptians, but not as the dynasties beginning way back in antiquity. What happened to these people? How did they just basically spiral downwards and then disappear? And we can work our way backwards historically to know that, for example, with the coming of Alexander the Great, that's much later in time, and later his generals that ruled over the declining Egypt. We see it, by the way. I'm a person that deals in antiquities. I have a great collection of antiquities. You can even see how sloppy the masks that once were painted with great detail become like a child painted it. It's not even within the lines of things. Things look almost mutilated. The shabtis that were once created with great precision to be buried with the pharaohs now look like they might have been chewed dog bones, very trace remnants of what was an exact art. So the question is, why the decline of these people? And don't just go with Cecil B. DeMille's idea that somehow when Pharaoh drowned with his army, that Egypt ceased. That's equally a great fallacy. We know, and we can follow the history. As I said, I collect artifacts. We can see as time goes by, there is, we'll call it a tightening to where the culture basically just dies off. What made that happen, and why did other cultures pop up somewhere else? This is the question. If Moses did not basically save or deliver the people as is chronicled, how do we explain in a later time, after the Assyrian and Babylonian captivity, once those are over, how do we explain between the first wave of people leaving, those Hyksos, to the last people who basically migrated? How do we explain the vast populace on the earth? When you start to examine the map, people like to tell you the origins of Italy, two strange creatures that, come on, really? Just go back and do a little digging, and you find, for example, the founding of another Troy and a person by the name of Brutus, and we'll weave all of this together, but the beginning point is to establish something very crucial. You see, if the children of Israel didn't go into bondage and didn't get delivered as an exodus, we have very little to go on to explain every other event in the Bible, including those people coming into the land that I just described to you out of the book of Joshua. We have very little to go on about anything else, because if they didn't go in, where did they go? You have to ask these questions, and if you're not willing to ask the questions and do the work, you probably should abandon even talking about the subject. But if you're going to go down this pathway, you can see something very, very clear. We'll look at in the coming messages not just the very obvious things like we know. Most of you who have heard teaching on the lost tribes know that Dan and the tribe of Dan, they too had an interesting, there are other exoduses amongst them. I don't know, and I cannot say for sure. I don't think anyone can say for certain, but I do believe that they had to be part, possibly, of that first exodus from the Hyksos. We know definitively from the book of Judges, while they're being attacked under Deborah's leadership, the lament is Dan is in his ships while they were basically poised to go somewhere. And if you read elsewhere, which I hope to show you in coming messages, you'll see that the population of the tribe of Dan is now shrunk for some reason. And then ultimately this all ties into, if you can believe it, it's all tied together. The question is, why is Dan not mentioned in the book of Revelation? Yet Dan is mentioned in the book of Ezekiel, speaking of a future time. And this all becomes part of a great puzzle of putting this back together and basically reconstructing the vast tapestry which God laid out so perfectly. Now one might ask, how can I glean from any of this? How can I glean something that is uplifting to my spirit today? And I'll tell you, if God can have this much control, we have free will, but if God can have this much control over history to manage to protect certain things that will show up elsewhere, and let me just give you an idea, that the laws, for example, that were put down by the first king of Athens perhaps get imported to Troy, and that law eventually will become, in type, the Magna Carta. And the Magna Carta will become, for us, our document of independence for this country. Things are all tied together, whether you like it or not. Thank God there's been a great foundation laid here, specifically tied to, most importantly, what happened through Chalcol eventually, and Ireland. And we know about the Tuatha De Danann, the people of Dan. But what is staggering is everything else around it. See, those are the obvious things. Those are the things that are in plain sight. When you look at, it's said by the blessings of Jacob, who is Israel, about Dan, his trail would be like a serpent. Well, they did indeed leave a trail. And all the places that you can find that bear the name Dan, the Danube River, Dardanelles, there's so many of that, Dinster, there's so many names, places, countries, cities, states, bearing the name Dan. Macedonia is actually Dania, and the Dons of Spain, actually, that is from Dan as well. When you begin to see how God has woven this incredible tapestry, you have to stand back for a minute and say, first of all, it's time for people in this country to grow up. It's time for people in this country to stop acting as though we either have to apologize or bow down or figure out. You know, if you figure out that you all come from the same mud pile, it's much easier. If you figure out that you slice open somebody's arm and the same red blood comes out of mine that comes out of someone who's got yellow, brown, or orange skin, you figure out real quickly that it is we who are the problem here. And looking at all this evidence, by the way, is not going to bring peace on earth, but it's going to solve a lot of, I think, questions that people have. Who are these people? Where did they come? Have you ever wondered this? Why certain people, for example, you look at certain people and their facial characteristics of certain people, we'll say people of Asiatic descent look a certain way, or people of a certain descent, they look a certain way. And why are these features like that? Have you ever stopped to ask those questions? It's quite perplexing. Now, the obvious and easiest thing is to say, well, they lived in a place where climate, they needed to have better cover over their eyes, or they needed this or that. But really, is that your only solution? Or can you come up with something better? See, as I study much of what went on in Egypt, I can see very, very clearly not just one people, but a multitude of people within Egypt. And if you start looking, just peeling back just that one area that we can greatly study, even statues, carvings, artwork begins to morph. Some of it looks a little bit more Asiatic. Some of it looks a little darker skin. Some of it looks very white and Caucasian. How is this possible? How did it happen? So it's my goal within the coming messages, God willing, to kind of bring all this to the forefront. And remember, I started with saying, if somebody says the Exodus, Moses' Exodus out of Egypt couldn't have occurred, my guess is that they really haven't stopped to either read this book and read it seriously, not just a superficial reading, but they have not stopped to examine all the abundant evidence that antiquity has yielded out of the earth. So my goal is not to give you a history lesson or to talk about how we got here primarily, but is to show God's hand in history. And that, by the way, if you see all of this unfold clearly, it actually makes sense for something in the future. You know, when we have the book of Revelation saying that there will be the tribes basically gathered and numbered, how do you think that's going to occur if we're talking about hundreds, if not thousands of years from the time that John wrote Revelation, late 90s AD, to whenever the end comes? How will these people know who they are? I don't even know who I am. When I start to look at this, it begins to make me scratch my head and say, maybe we aren't who we really are. Maybe there's much more to this. And maybe when God has, at the end, revealed everything, it will become clear to us, by the way, why Dan is absent, but how he himself, God, will pull from all these people to gather up once more to establish these particular people. You've got to be able to sort that out, and by the way, I think only God can do that. So the next time I talk to you, hopefully God willing, will be the continuation of this message as the foundation. I hope I haven't made your ears or your head hurt, but leave here today with something uplifting, which is, and I've always said this about everything, but really you can see God's hand in history. If you can look at God's hand in history and see how much in control he was, how much more for the individual yourself, how much more is God not with you and in control of your circumstances and events, both past, present, and future. That's my message. I'm Pastor Melissa Scott, pastor of Faith Center, Glendale, California. I teach every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. If you'd like to attend services with us, simply call the 800 number, that is 800-338-3030, to join us. If you'd like to watch, listen, and learn 24 hours a day, simply log on to our website at www.pastormelissascott.com.